Welcome back to Risky Business, our show about making better decisions. I'm Maria Konnikova.
And I'm Nate Silver. Today, we're going to be talking, as you might expect, more about the elections. There's been a lot of, frankly, dark and disturbing news. There's also been a lot of polling since the debate. We'll tell you more about what it says and where our forecast is.
We'll also talk about Kalshi and prediction markets and betting on political outcomes in the United States. There's been some big news on that last week. And finally, we're going to take it to a more personal place and talk about the saga that I've been having with air conditioning in the midst of a New York City summer. Let's start off with election models, Trump's assassination, the debates. All of this stuff has happened since we last spoke. I mean, the debates happened the day before we last spoke, but none of that data had been incorporated into the models. There were no quality polls out. What has changed? Have we seen quality polls in the last week? Where do the data stand now? How have your election model predictions shifted?
Are you implying that data is plural, Maria?
Data are plural. Nate.
Oh my God, it's been a great run. Thank you for listening to Risky Business, but we have irreconcilable differences and the show
Datum is singular.
Oh my God. Look, before the debate, Harris was ahead in national polls by about 2 percentage points. And now she appears to be ahead by roughly 3 percentage points. And there has been quite a bit of high quality data at the national level. Why is that number important? Well, the Electoral College bias, according to our forecast, Silver Bulletin forecast, favors Trump by about 2.5 points. So kind of the point spread is if Harris wins the popular vote by 2.5 points or more, she's a favorite in the Electoral College. If she wins by less than 2.5 points, she probably doesn't get over the finish line in states like Pennsylvania. So therefore, this is a good development for her. There's other stuff too. The question is, how sustainable is this? If you get like a short-term bounce and maybe the news cycle already moves on to things like this other attempt on Trump's life or conspiracy theories about what Haitian immigrants are doing, then we'll see. But in contrast to this kind of Labor Day period where she was getting a lot of mediocre data, like from the New York Times, this is now back on track for basically a toss-up election.
Well, that's good news. I mean,
if you're a Harris fan,
as people know, I am. It's good news for Harris. But where are we in terms of the poll cycle? Right? Do you expect that this is that the highest quality polls have already come out, or do you expect that we're going to be updating this significantly in the coming week or two?
No, what happens after a big event typically is the national polls go first. If you're going to conduct one poll, then you do a national poll first. And we're waiting over the next week or two to populate infill with some of the higher quality state polling data. Look, earlier this month, Harris was getting some pretty mediocre numbers in state polls. She got, for example, Suffolk is a good poll. Suffolk University had her up 3 in Pennsylvania, but a lot more polls have had Pennsylvania, Michigan, and whatnot, basically a tie recently. So we'll see. If those state polls also improve for her by a point or two, then we might be at a point where you would say the race leans slightly toward her. If they don't, you might go back to saying that race leans slightly toward Trump. I know it's frustrating. I wish I could have a crystal ball here and predict what they would say. But that Electoral College gap is I think it's counterintuitive for people. If you're used to seeing headlines saying Harris ahead, tie, Harris ahead, lots of reporting in the national polls. Again, Biden won the popular vote by 4.5 points in 2020 and just barely won the Electoral College by a point or so in Wisconsin. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 2.1 points in 2016 and lost the Electoral College, lost all these Midwestern states, for example. So you can't look at these national polls and feel too complacent if you're a Democrat.
And are we still looking at Pennsylvania as kind of this benchmark? Because you have written about the Pennsylvania polls in the last few days. So I'm kind of curious to see where we stand there. You just briefly mentioned it, but I'd love to kind of go into a little bit more detail because you've also had some of those paths to victory that might not seem intuitive. Like you had one post called Alaska, Alaska, Alaska,
Alaska,
which
Alaska, Alaska.
which I thought was quite funny. But can you elaborate a little bit and can we talk about kind of the first Pennsylvania and then what different paths to victory might look like if we don't, if we stay within this margin and don't see Harris improving?
Yeah, so Pennsylvania is the most likely what we call tipping point state. The short version is it's the state that gives you the 270th electoral vote. That's the state, that's the number that guarantees you a victory in the electoral college. A longer version, if you line up all the states from most blue to most red and add up the electoral votes, that's where you get over the finish line. But basically, it's the decisive state about a third of the time in our model. But it's not alone in that department. There's about a 30% chance that Pennsylvania is the tipping point state, which means there's a 70% chance that it isn't. Harris, unlike Biden, I mean, Biden kind of had to win Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, very narrow path, whereas Harris has often been getting better numbers in Georgia, for example. North Carolina is a state that comes up quite a bit. Those states both have 16 electoral votes. Pennsylvania has 19. So you can't quite substitute one for the other, but there are combinations that work.
Mhm.
North Carolina plus Nevada, or North Carolina plus Arizona.
Nevada, Nate, Nevada.
Nevada. Or if you want to get really creative, Nevada plus Arizona plus Alaska, where a poll came out this weekend showing Harris down by only 4 points. Now, do
By
I
the way,
believe
when is
that?
when is the last time a Democrat has taken Alaska?
1964, LBJ, I believe, won Alaska. People actually thought when Alaska and Hawaii entered the country, the Union, that Alaska would be Democratic and Hawaii would be Republican, and the reverse has been true instead.
That's fascinating.
But Alaska has a Democrat representative named Mary Peltola, who is a lone U.S. House representative for the state. At the state legislature level, it's kind of bipartisan. Its population is changing a lot. About 4% of the population moves into Alaska every year. It's a transient workforce. I don't know if you're getting the expats from California and stuff like that. So Harris does have more paths, but there's not any one safe path. Let's also remember, by the way, I don't mean to scare our Democratic listeners. Let's also remember that in these Midwestern swing states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, those are states where polls have overrated Democrats in the past couple of elections. So how safe should you feel if you're ahead by 1 point in Wisconsin when Biden was up by 7 points in Wisconsin and only won by 1 point, for example? Maybe not that safe.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair point. But yeah, I mean, I think that the fact that we're seeing these polls so close, it's better than last week when we spoke, right? Where Harris was clearly behind for Harris, better for Harris. Your model quality has not changed. It reflects like let's just be clear. Your model reflects reality, and then when I say better, worse, I'm just talking to you about my own, political preferences, which I'm very open about. So it is a movement from last week, but again, there is still a long way to go. Now, what about the Trump assassination attempt? Are we seeing any effects from that? Will we see effects from that? Because obviously that happened over the weekend, and we're recording this on Tuesday, September 17th, so it's not like polls come out, every single day that incorporate new events. But I'm curious whether there have been any shifts and whether you expect any shifts or not.
I don't know. I mean, we should also. So clearly, the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania, was a very serious incident where Trump was injured and could have been killed if he didn't move
Absolutely.
his head at the right point in time. And person was killed, and other people were injured. Now, if you look at like the Wikipedia list, I don't know how credible it is, but I assume for list type stuff, it's okay. The list of failed assassination attempts, it's a longer list, and it's somewhat more common to see plots foiled. This guy got further than a lot of people. It was a guy at a golf course hiding in the bushes. For some reason, he decided to wear a pink shirt, which is not known as a color that helps you camouflage very well.
Yes, it's not traditional camouflage. That's true.
So I don't know whether this gets kind of talked about or thought of as an event that totally disrupts the news cycle. In prediction markets, we'll talk about in a moment, it did not particularly move the numbers for what it's worth. I mean, look, I don't know. I mean, this election's turned pretty dark. Um, I think needless to say, right? I mean, there probably should be more investigation into the Secret Service and what they are or are not doing. I don't know. That's not a bigger topic. For example, you have, Elon Musk making this awful joke about why hasn't anyone tried to assassinate the Democrats.
That was low even for Elon.
Even for Elon, you have, I mean, I don't know. No matter what, we'll get accused of false equivocation. I mean, you also have on this Haitian immigrant story, some of the stuff is pretty outright racist, I think. And you also have like JD Vance saying, well, maybe it's not, I'm paraphrasing slightly, maybe it's not strictly true, but at least it's a way to get people talking about immigration more. I mean, first of all, you're not supposed to say that part, JD Vance, right? You're saying the quiet part out loud, and it's just so bizarre and weird. I don't know, Maria. There comes a time when, and this is after a period when after she took over, after Biden was shoved out of the way. He didn't honorably step aside. He was shoved out of the way by Nancy Pelosi and people who are smart and want to win in the Democratic Party. Harris ran this kind of sunnier, happier campaign, and I don't know, sometimes after Labor Day, things just turn dark.
Yeah, this has been a very dark election. I think that's a good way of putting it. I don't remember. Obviously, people use opposition research and underhanded tactics always, right? Like that's not new, but this has turned dark in many respects. I mean, I think is this the first time that a presidential candidate has had two attempted assassination attempts in the run-up to the election?
I think that's technically no. Like Gerald Ford had, I don't know if it was during I guess he was president.
Right. One was
for re-election.
Yeah, but still, okay. Ford, I guess, would qualify. But yeah, it's just, it feels like this is a different world, right? And brave new is are not the adjectives we want to be using for it.
Yeah, look, the way I liken this is a little bit to, here's another analogy that'll probably piss half our audience off. It's
okay. It's okay. As long as we keep passing off different halves, then it all evens out.
It's a little bit like climate change in the sense that any one severe weather event like a hurricane is hard to attribute to climate change. But when you have a climate when people are saying violent things, and I don't think the parties are equally responsible for this. I think Trump is much more likely to engage in violent rhetoric, but there's plenty of objectionable stuff on the Democratic side too. The risk of violence is higher, and we've seen these two attempts on Trump's life. We saw Paul Pelosi, the Speaker, former Speaker of the House's husband, attacked. You had a shooting in a congressional baseball game back, I guess this was several years ago, 2017, but still kind of in this modern era, 2016 onward. Then it's been kind of a violent time in American political life. I think in politics, people feel like they have license to behave really badly. They feel self-righteous about it. I don't know, Maria.
No, it's not good. And I think that we're forgetting, so much about why democracy works, what makes democracy different from other forms of government, that we're supposed to have peaceful transitions of power, that peace is kind of supposed to be built into the system. Right now, the United States in some of what's going on is more resembling, countries that are dictatorships, that are that are not used to having peaceful transitions of power. And I think that that's highly problematic. And I hope that it's not a harbinger of things to come. I hope that we are looking at a blip in time that will disappear, but that's just hope, right? That has no basis in reality. And right now the reality is actually showing us that we're veering off into another direction. And we need data and we need to see what happens. But right now it's not looking pretty.
Yeah, like I think Democrats feel like, oh, if we just kind of defeat Donald Trump, we solve the problem, right?
No.
But I'm not sure how true that is
Yeah.
exactly. Clearly, a lot of these other Republican candidates are trying to emulate Trump's image. It is interesting though. The GOP brand is not terribly popular. Like they're still losing a lot of these races for Senate and the House. They'll probably take over the Senate because you have these Democrats that are up in very red states that might tip the balance. But in the swing states, they're often down by 5 or 6 points, and I think somehow Trump sometimes gets a pass from voters, or maybe just Trump is kind of a guy who is he has a certain charisma that resonates with a certain type of voter. People think that he is on their side, whereas you kind of see like the more charisma-less version with, say, JD Vance, for example. So maybe it's right that if Democrats win this election too, and Trump is then 1 for 3, although who knows? Is there any reason why he wouldn't run in 2028? I don't inherently see why not, right?
Age is the only thing that I might say in case there's, any infirmity or anything that really prevents him from running. I think that that's the only thing that would really stop him.
I mean, he'd be the same age as Biden tried to run this year, although I guess it's a negative indicator.
Yeah, look at how well that turned out.
Yeah.
So just to kind of wrap this up, is there anything else that you think we should be looking at in the next week? Do you expect to see any changes in the coming week, or do we just need to kind of wait and see what happens?
Yeah, I hate to sound like a broken record, but are you seeing for Harris poll showing her up 1 or 2 points in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, failing that, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada,
Well done.
Nevada. Now I'm saying it weird. Nevada.
Nevada.
Okay.
Nevada. You got it.
Okay. It's one of those words where I feel like, like if you know someone named Megan, but then it's Megan, and
Yep.
then you screw you because you're like, oh, it's not the way I think it is. So then you get screwed up between Megan and Megan. I just think people should consolidate these names, right? We should, how like in France, you're only allowed certain surnames, or Germany or something, right?
Yep.
We should stipulate Sarah with an H and Sarah with an A. You just got to get together and pick one.
I can see how that's going to play out. Nate, if that's part of your political platform, I'm going to tell you right now, you're going to lose.
Why?
Parents on both sides of the party spectrum are going to fight you to the death on that. They want their creative spellings.
They're misspelled half the time.
I completely agree with you, but I do not have children. And I think that a lot of people would disagree with us and would say that they need the freedom to spell the name however they want to spell it. And I think at some point that goes just a little bit too far. I'm all for simplification. Sarahs and Sarahs of the world unite. So last week, there was some major news in the prediction market space. So Nate, we give this disclaimer all the time. You're an advisor for Polymarket. We're not talking about Polymarket right now. Polymarket is not legal in the United States. There is a prediction market that is legal in the United States called Kalshi. And last week, it won its federal lawsuit against the Commodity Futures Trading Commission in order to be able to offer contracts on which party will control each House of Congress after the election. And this was a huge, huge deal, right? Because betting on elections has not been legal in the United States. It's been this huge lightning rod, this huge argument against prediction markets in general. And the fact that Kalshi won this lawsuit was just absolutely huge news. So right after it won, it actually offered these contracts. People started betting on them. And then a few hours later, they had to freeze them because the CFTC said, hold on, freeze. We want to contest this. We don't think this should be legal. And right now we're kind of in this holding pattern. No one knows what's going to happen to the people who already placed their bets last week during the few hours that betting was open. And we don't know what's going to happen. They were supposed to potentially resolve this yesterday, Monday. As of today, Tuesday, September 17th, they still have not resolve this. So the U.S. Court of Appeals and the D.C. Circuit is waiting. We're waiting to hear how they rule on this, and that's going to do a lot to determine the future of political betting in the United States. Let's talk about this because, this is something that Kalshi has been fighting for over 4 years. And not just Kalshi, obviously, other prediction markets, but Kalshi's been doing it from within the United States, bringing it through the court systems. And it's a big, big deal.
Yeah, whereas Polymarket has an agreement with the CFTC not to allow trading in the US. As I need to say, whenever this type of subject comes up, I have a conflict of interest here. I am an advisor to a competing prediction market called Polymarket. The reason I'm an advisor to them is partly because they compensate me, but also because I believe in prediction markets as a product. But look, the basic argument for prediction markets is that market risk inherently has to price in political risk anyway. If you're thinking about how different classes of equities will move, or interest rates, or foreign markets, U.S. policy toward China or whatnot, people already are factoring in who's going to win the election, how political events might unfold, including like foreign elections, for example. So why not allow people to bet on this directly instead of kind of filtered through other types of more imprecise commodities? The CFTC says they're worried about market manipulation. And they can cite, for example, people placing fake polls out there. We've seen this sometimes, actually, where you'll see people make up credible rumors of a poll, whether they're doing that just to fuck with people or because it's a way to manipulate markets. I'm not so sure. But the question is, why is this in a different category than, say, betting on sports, where you have seen efforts to throw matches and manipulation, or trading equities and things like that? If you have like a Donald Trump stock, he has DFT. You have things that are kind of proxies for the election anyway. Bitcoin often moves upward and downward. It's seen as Trump is seen as bullish for Bitcoin. So if you have Trump having a bad debate, like he had last week, for example, Bitcoin goes down. So I don't know. I think the CFTC has always been very, if you read my book, they're very villagey, right? They seem to think that like trading or gambling is bad and evil and will taint the political system, when it's like, I don't know. Alex, excuse me. I always like the phrase that a bet is a tax on bullshit. It's not uncommon for me to like be in an argument with somebody on Twitter and to say, okay, you actually believe what you're saying? Let's bet on it. Let's bet some real money.
Has anyone, by the way, ever taken you up on it? Because I've seen you offer it to so many people, and I've never seen someone say yes.
They're always cowards, right? They're always cowards. They're always cowards because they don't actually mean what they say most of the time, right? They're talking a big game and they don't actually mean what they say. And I don't know, maybe it's a weird thing to want to like bet on all this stuff, but yeah. Yeah, by the way, we won't get into Alan Lichtman today. That feels like too much of a detour.
We can, but first, let's stay on Kalshi for a little bit and betting on elections. So you said a few things, and there's one thing that that I completely agree with, which is that to really test someone's opinion, bet on it, right? We did not invent this. I think I've cited Immanuel Kant on this podcast before. He was one of the original proponents that if you say something's going to happen, if you have a certainty in it, how much money are you willing to bet on it, right? What will you place on it? And he did see this as a tax on bullshit and on false certainty, on false confidence. And he thought that this would really be a very strong corrective towards people just proselytizing and giving unfounded opinions and trying to, stand on a soapbox without actual knowledge or backing, that you really needed to put your money where your mouth is. And so in that sense, betting on politics, great, right? It helps calibrate outcomes. It helps kind of figure out where things are standing because people really have skin in the game as opposed to just kind of standing on their soapbox, which when it comes to politics, everyone has a soapbox and everyone wants to scream loudly. But let's look at the other side of it. So You said something which was, if we're betting on sports where there has been manipulation, people have tried to throw games, why aren't we allowed to bet on politics? I would say I think this is a huge problem in sports betting as well. We've talked about this. And if you think it's a huge problem in sports and that people are throwing games and that it actually is kind of adding some of this uncertainty to certain outcomes where you can't really tell, did this person actually, fumble? Did they throw the game on purpose? It introduces a lot of shades of gray the moment that you can bet on some of these outcomes, including just these crazy prop bets, right? Not just the outcome of the game, but there are these just insane prop bets that have a lot of money riding on them during the game. But think about at the end of the day, it's a sports game. I know there are listeners of the show who are huge sports fans, but it's not going to change the fate of the world. When we're talking about politics, those things become amplified because we're now playing in a different ballgame. Let's mix metaphors here and bring sports to politics. It's a different game that we're playing with much higher stakes, where any potential impropriety, manipulation, things that could actually throw elections one way or another, one outcome one way or another, they become much bigger deals, right? We actually have to pay attention to that. Now, what I'm not saying is this is the case and we can't allow betting on elections. What I'm saying is we need to talk about this. We need to consider it. We need to try to figure out, what are the pros? What are the cons? What's the risk of this? And given that, what kinds of tools also do we want to offer? Because prediction markets don't just offer, a straight out bet on the outcome of the election, right? There are contracts, there are derivatives markets, there are all sorts of secondary things where you get to bet on all sorts of things. And so even if we, once you and I talk about it, even if we agree that, okay, some sorts of betting is okay, that doesn't necessarily mean that all sorts of betting is okay. And we can then go back to sports and say, okay, these things are not necessarily okay either. I'm talking a lot in generalities right now, just because I want to kind of lay out some of the points that I think we should discuss.
Look, I think, in some sense, I think it kind of almost cuts the other way that there is economic value created. You have more market efficiency and less deadweight loss when you're allowed to trade on these things that move markets anyway, instead of having to go through proxies. That's a very University of Chicago economist hat thing to argue, whereas I'm not sure there's any value per se created by sports betting. For some people, it's fun. For some people, it's addictive. It's a tough game to win, to be sure. So I don't know. I mean, and there's also this argument that if things are more regulated, then it's easier to catch market manipulation, for better or worse. DraftKings and FanDuel can say, yeah, we have these unusual betting patterns. NBA, you should go investigate this. NFL, you should go investigate this. If it's regulated versus occurring in offshore crypto markets and so forth. But anyway, I'm biased here. I'm clearly biased. I like betting.
Of course.
I like trading, right? And I consult for one of these companies. So I'm totally biased, but I've always thought the CFTC was kind of nitty.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that, but I can also see the argument for if you are able to manipulate markets even for a short period of time. And by the way, last week there was an attempt to do this on Polymarket during the debates, right? There was an attempt to improve Kamala Harris's odds over a short period of time. One person bet over 2.5 million to move the markets. It didn't end up working, so the market ended up correcting. So this is an argument in favor of self-correcting markets. But if you think about a billionaire, right, who is willing to put in more money and willing to kind of do this in a more egregious way, even if it does end up correcting eventually, we know that especially in close elections, even rumors, even kind of things that say, these days you can actually open not most, but a lot of news stories will actually say the Polymarket odds, right? Will say Donald Trump is at X, Kamala Harris is at Y. So those things can be self-fulfilling prophecies. They can actually influence people's perceptions of how something is going, influence their behavior. There are these cycles where, just psychologically speaking, I think it's something to think about.
There are a couple of concerns here. One is that sometimes Polymarket and other prediction markets will have these complicated derivative contracts. You can predict will Harris be ahead on Polymarket at X and Y time on Z and Y day. And then it may be worth it to try to move the market so that you win the derivative contract. Like stuff like that should probably get cleaned up.
Yes.
And yeah, I mean, and there can be this kind of circular literalism almost where people assume the prediction markets are wise. And then so actually one example, you remember this a couple weeks ago, there were rumors that there would be a special guest at the Democratic
Yes,
convention.
people thought Beyonce was potentially going to sing.
Yeah,
That's where it ended up going.
People thought Taylor Swift, people thought Beyonce, right? And then Beyonce was up to like 97% on Polymarket. And then TMZ releases a story where her spokesperson said, no, she's not even in Chicago right now, right? It's not happening. And that was a case where people looked at the prediction markets and said, boy, they must know something. They must know something. Because they have gotten other stuff right. They were smart about the impact of the debates. They were smart about Harris, the day that Tim Walz was named.
Yeah, they got
Josh
Walz
Shapiro.
before.
I think I don't know, people were like scouting out the Tim Walz residence or something. So they are remarkably right a lot of the time. But sometimes you have this overconfident phenomenon where people think they're infallible. And then there's and this is true for other types of markets too, right? I am not a complete believer in efficient market hypothesis.
Yeah. So if you think about, once again, the repercussions when it's something that's more significant, right? Like the elections, like politics, I think that there is room, obviously, for these type of markets to exist. And obviously there's an argument that they exist already, right? So as you said, regulate, like allow them and be strict about it. But when you're talking about things like these derivatives contracts, all these secondary things, like I think that we do need to have some rules in place, right? Like there's not allowing markets for political betting does not mean allowing all markets on everything with every single type of financial instrument, right? That one does not follow from the other. We can have very specific rules, even with crypto, right? Like we've talked about ETH and Bitcoin and, the very narrow, like the path that they've had to go through, right, to allow one very specific type of financial instrument in order to be able to trade in proxy.
Yeah, this is true in sports betting markets too, which is that there's so much pressure to offer so many different derivatives of markets for every possible type of event and things like that. And the more robust business model is to kind of keep it simple, right? You can bet on the money line and the point spread and the total. If there's a player injury situation, then they'll take it off the board instead of being subject to inside information. They're not going to let you bet on things. This is again like the more robust betting platforms like Circa, for example, which is known for actually taking action from sharp winning players and properly doing handicapping, or bookmaking, I should say, not handicapping. But there's this pressure to like offer you to bet on everything and have this gigantic menu that's often a false front, right? If you try to bet some of the weird stuff on DraftKings or FanDuel, then you'll get limited right away if you're any good. So keeping things simple, I think, is a lesson here for everybody.
Yeah, keeping things simple and also potentially limiting in the moment things, right? Like one of the issues with last week's attempt to manipulate the markets was it was during the debate, right? They were trying to keep those markets open during a very specific window. It's like when you're allowed to place sports bets on certain outcomes in the middle of a game. And there are even, in some countries, like the sports bets will actually pop up on your screen as you're watching a game, and you can place bets. And we know that this appeals to your degen heart on some level, but I think that especially when it comes to politics, limiting things like that, and trying to figure out, okay, what is necessary, what is least likely to be manipulated? How do we place limits on manipulation, right? Could it be that like you actually are not allowed to bet $10 million? Is that a thing, or is that like not a thing, right? Should we allow bets of any size on anything? I don't know. These are all things that I'm just throwing out. I haven't thought this through to try to figure out, how do we play safely?
With the prediction markets, right, then look, hedge funds and so forth may be placing very large bets on any type of economic variable, right? Millions of dollars and stuff like that. So like, so if you say, oh, you can only bet $5,000 on an outcome. And there have been things like the Iowa electronic markets are a market that lets you bet in small amounts. Then the market doesn't really clear, and that can, push toward other alternatives, can push toward offshore alternatives, for example.
Oh, sure. And I wasn't talking 5,000. That's why I said 10 million, which is one of the event.
Well, the other thing too is there's so much money in elections that, and there have, by the way, been, so in 2008, there were allegedly, I think, credibly some reports of people trying to buy John McCain stock or buying John McCain stock on prediction market platforms back then, because it was a relatively cheap way to move the media narrative, right? You spend a few $1,000 and someone writes a story about, oh, look, the smart traders know that McCain is surging now on I don't know what the platform, Trade Sports, whatever it was back then. Now that the volumes are more liquid, it's harder to do that. You can't really spend $1,000 and have any lasting effect, but yeah.
But you can spend millions and have an effect, right? We did see that they did, like I said, I just keep going to last week because it just happened last week, right? This is just something that's easily accessible to my mind. The 2.5 million and those few bets did move the markets, right? They did correct, but now let's assume it was on something that was more important. I do think that we just need to figure out, how do we take this into account? How are we aware of this? How do we make sure that, we can have markets that actually reflect real sentiment, opinion, so that they do clear, so that they are put your money where your mouth is types of things, as opposed to how do I make more money by trying to kind of manipulate this for a short period of time? Or how do I get my preferred candidate to win by, putting 100 million in the prediction markets on my candidate, moving the narrative, getting those stories, and actually in a very, very tight election where we're talking about, 1 point lead here, 1 point lead there, where something like that might actually, as we know with Poker Nate, every little piece of a percentage matters when you're talking
it's
about
also it's also very directionally unclear, though, why you even care that much about the narrative. It's not clear that it, whether it makes people complacent or makes people turn out or whatever else. It's not entirely clear. You've had this funny thing.
That is true.
You've had this funny thing where, when Harris, now she's been moving back up in the forecast, but a period of a week or two ago when she was moving down in the Silver Bulletin forecast, you had both Trump and Harris citing the forecast. Trump said that Nate Silver, I hear, is a pretty smart guy, which is not what he said about me 4 years ago. Meanwhile, the Harris campaign is blasting out the forecast and saying, look, we're the underdogs in this race, trying to manage expectations. That speaks to the different personality types between Democrats and Republicans. But people, I think there are a lot of, can I use this term? A lot of losers out there who are mistaking winning the news cycle or dunking on somebody for winning the election, and they often have nothing to do with one another. The more you can chill out and be looking toward the long term, what's our long-term strategy for November, then the better off you are than trying to win the day, quote unquote.
So I'm going to ask a dumb question, dumb because I think the answer to this is easily available. I just have not looked it up. Do we know whether voter turnout is affected by your perception of how close the election is versus how well your candidate is doing? Because, if you think back to Hillary Clinton versus Trump, because she was such a favorite, even though we know that in your model, Trump had a 28%, yes, correct, chance of winning, that you're less likely to vote because you'll say, oh, it doesn't really matter that much. Do we have good data on how that works?
There's data that turnout is higher the closer the polls are. Whether that's because of the polls or not is hard to know. So yeah, in swing states, they tend to have, holding other factors equal, higher turnout. I mean, again, we don't know how exogenous or endogenous this is.
Right.
The campaigns spend more in those states and knock on more doors, and there's more advertising, and the candidates visit, and all those things, right? There's more infrastructure. So the causality is hard to know, but there is that pattern for sure.
So in that sense, that's where the narratives end up mattering a little bit, right? Where if we can, depending on how we can frame the cycle, frame how close the election is, who's ahead, who's behind, potentially, right? It might affect 1,000 voters, 2,000 voters, but sometimes that's all you need. I know that in the midterm election in Nevada, during which I voted, not a secret, voted for the Democrats. The Democrats ended up carrying some of those seats by a few thousand votes. I think it was like 2,000 something, right? It was like tiny. And that's when you realize, oh, wow, like it actually does matter exactly how many people went out to the polls. Once again, as you know, I am all for prediction markets. I'm for betting on outcomes. I just think that, you know, these are all really important questions, and we should be looking at, just like you look at Alaska, we should consider edge cases. We should consider these spots where it might affect a tiny fraction of people, but that tiny fraction is enough in swing states. You know, these are things that we should talk about still, even if it's not very likely.
By the way, it was In Trade, I am reliably told by our friendly producers. In Trade was the platform with the McCain manipulation in 2008, not Trade Sports.
All right. Well, there you have it. Yeah. So these are lots of things for both of us to think about, I think. And I'm really interested to see how this Kalshi decision will play out. Maybe by the time our listeners are tuning in, the appeals court will have already rendered their decision, but they're not known to move quickly. So who in the world knows?
So, Maria, I've been traveling. I was in London a week and a half ago. I was in Wyoming for last week's episode. Now I'm in San Francisco. The result, I'm like jet lagged in both directions, and it's just completely random when I get hungry. Sometimes I'm like starving at like 5 a.m. and then not all hungry during regular people hours. Anyway, so I have not been in on the gossip about your air conditioning situation. So I just want you to take it away. What is going on with your AC?
Nate, you've been to my house in New York, and you know that we used to not have air conditioning. It's an old brownstone. We had window units, and that is how we air conditioned our apartment. And New York summers have been getting quite hot and quite sticky, and this was just getting more and more unbearable. I thought I was doing something really good and finally upgrading our, old apartment that had window units to split AC units that get installed in the wall, much more efficient, much nicer. Um, Fast forward to today, we weren't there when these units got installed. 2 of them work great. There are 3 rooms in my apartment. The one in the bedroom, not so great. There is a pump that will not shut the fuck up. This is the loudest water pump you have ever heard. It's
Can you imitate it? Can you imitate it?
Glug, glug, glug.
Okay. Okay.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Very good. And very loud. And it does it all the time. So not just when there's water in it. The reason it's so loud is that it does it when there's no water in it either. So anyway, completely faulty, needs to be replaced. Has not been patched up because we complained immediately when we saw this. So our bedroom is just one big gaping hole, holes in the wall, holes in the ceiling, exposed insulation, and this fucking pump, which makes it impossible to sleep. And so basically, there's no AC in the bedroom. You cannot run that thing because it is so damn loud. And I honestly, I do not know what to do, because when I told them multiple times that this needs to happen, the latest is that it will not happen until mid-October, by which point I will be long gone in Las Vegas, which is my.
I got news for you, Maria. Got news for you. It gets a little cold, and I don't know what voice I'm doing here. It gets cold by October. Who cares about air conditioning?
No one cares about AC by October, but we do care about the fact that our walls and ceilings are wide open and the insulation is completely exposed, and we live on the top floor of a tiny walk-up. So this actually does matter because the insulation in this building ain't the best. So Nate, I honestly do not know, what is my plus EV move? What am I supposed to do to try to get this AC installed as quickly as possible and just get this work done? And
sometimes, Maria, there are only negative EV moves, and you have to pick the least negative EV move.
That's not what I wanted you to say.
Yeah, it was in a TSA situation. So the TSA doesn't always like it when you bring your podcast equipment through the plane. They don't like your mics or whatever, right? And so there was just long line. There was some guy who decided to bring a knife, like a dual-sided knife in his carry-on luggage, which, some German fellow, that seems like a pretty bad idea at a major commercial airport. This caused a big delay, and I'm like, I could complain about this, but that's just going to make it worse, right? There's no saying nothing is the only plus EV play in that situation, I think.
Yeah, and
if
I
they
think
have you by the balls, then you just gotta, yeah.
I
don't
think
know.
they kind of have us by the balls, and there's really nothing that I can do, but it's awful. I feel like I should be able to do something, like maybe get someone else to finish it, but then that someone else is going to charge, another arm and a leg to do the replacement work and fix this, and it's very rare for me to be in a situation where it seems like there's no plus EV outcome, right? Like I wanted to do something good for the apartment to make it more livable, and at the end of the day, it's a million times worse than the situation we had before. And my decision-making mind wants there to be a decision calculus that says, this is the correct branch of the decision tree. But it seems like the correct branch, as you say, is just saying nothing and hoping for the best and trying to be nice, which is what I've done. But being nice has gotten me absolutely nowhere so far.
I think it's a wrap then, Maria. Hopefully we'll have
Nate, you don't have any better strategy advice for me. What does your betting market say?
You could complain to the city.
That's true.
I think, the city, I think, actually protects tenants a lot. So
okay. Maybe complain to the city. That seems like a lot of effort.
I know a lot of people like complain. It's New York. It's New York. True. There's a lot of complaining.
This is true. I do not like complaining. So we'll see. I hope that I have a better update soon. But if I had a betting market on the likelihood of Maria getting her AC fixed before she leaves for Las Vegas, I'd be betting against that.